Welcome to The Debate. In emergency medicine, there is this incredible comfort in O-negative blood.
Oh, absolutely. The universal donor.
Right. No matter who is on the trauma table, no matter where you are in the world, or, what the patient-specific biology looks like, you can just transfuse it. It bypasses all the complex matching. It just works.
It's a biological baseline. It saves a life when there is, zero time to parse the nuances, right? Universally applicable, instantly effective.
Exactly. And for the last 50 years or so, we've treated modern medical ethics as if it has a universal donor, too.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically, the principle of individual patient autonomy. We treat a patient's right to independently consent to or refuse treatment as the ethical O-negative. We assume that because it works so beautifully in one context, we can just, pack it in ice and ship it anywhere on the globe.
But see, unlike blood types, ethics doesn't exist in a biological vacuum. When you try to transfuse a highly individualized Western concept of autonomy into a patient whose very identity is inextricably bound up in their community, the body politic rejects it. We end up causing profound harm in the name of ethical purity.
And that brings us to the core of what we're unpacking today. We are wrestling with a massive 5,000-year history of medical ethics across 14 major cultural traditions.
Yeah, stretching from the Code of Hammurabi all the way to, the governance of modern artificial intelligence in the clinic.
Right, and the central academic question we're debating is this. Is the principle of individual patient autonomy a universal, ethical baseline, like an absolute requirement to protect patients from abuse, or is it a culturally specific construct?
Right. Does imposing it globally commit epistemic injustice, essentially discounting someone's capacity as a moral agent just because their background prioritizes communal values?
So my position on this is that individual autonomy is exactly that universal baseline. It serves as the non-negotiable floor for patient protection against exploitation and paternalism.
And I take the opposing perspective. Elevating individual autonomy to a universal, supreme principle just ignores deeply rooted relational traditions. By insisting on this rigid framework, we commit a form of medical colonialism and fail patients whose personhood is communally constituted.
Okay, but let me start by clarifying why I see autonomy as non-negotiable. It wasn't just pulled out of a philosopher's armchair. It was forged in the fires of 20th century atrocities. It was codified in documents like the Nuremberg Code and the Belmont Report. I argue it's a universal legal and moral boundary, plain and simple.
You frame Nuremberg as this grand universal awakening, but we really have to look at what it actually was.
Which was a response to horrific abuses.
A specific, trauma-driven response to a horrific failure of Western institutions. I mean, the history of medical ethics is coextensive with the history of medicine itself.
Sure, but thousands of years before Nuremberg, we had the Shataka Samhita in the Ayurvedic tradition. That established the Chatushpada framework, a four-part therapeutic alliance between physician, patient, nurse, and medicine. We had Sun Symyo in 7th century China systematizing Confucian benevolence into clinical practice.
Right, I'm not saying those didn't exist.
And Ishaq ibn Ali al-Ruhawi writing dedicated treatises during the Islamic Golden Age. These were incredibly sophisticated systems of accountability.
They were sophisticated, yes, but let's be honest about how they actually functioned in practice. They were almost entirely paternalistic.
Well,
they positioned the patient as a passive recipient of the physician's benevolence. I mean, for thousands of years, medical ethics was basically just virtue ethics. The idea was, if the doctor is a good, honorable person, the patient will be safe.
Right. But the 20th century proved catastrophically that professional character is not enough to protect vulnerable people.
Which is exactly why the West overcorrected.
It wasn't an overcorrection. It was an essential paradigm shift. The Nuremberg doctors' trial in 1946 exposed how entirely insufficient those old professional codes were against state-sponsored evil.
I understand the catalyst, but
when the Nuremberg Code was drafted, its foundational first principle was revolutionary. It said, the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. It irreversibly dismantled that physician-centered paternalism. Think about the Tuskegee syphilis study.
Yeah, of course.
A 40-year span where black men were left untreated without their consent, long after penicillin was available. That proved that without a strict framework of individual autonomy, vulnerable populations are inevitably treated as a means to an end.
I acknowledge the profound trauma of Tuskegee and Nazi medicine. Absolutely. But applying a trauma response mechanism to routine global medicine is fundamentally flawed. When the global medical establishment declares that this specific post-1947 Western mechanism is the only legitimate way to practice ethics, we just marginalize centuries of non-Western moral wisdom.
Look, I view individual autonomy like a personal safe deposit box. Only you have the key.
Okay.
It might seem rigid, it might even seem isolating, but it guarantees that nobody else, not the state, not your doctor, not even your family, can spend your health or your bodily integrity without your explicit signature.
But see, that assumes wealth is individually owned.
What do you mean?
Well, for many cultures, health is a dual bank account. Its transactions require multiple signatures to ensure the stability of the whole family. Let's look at Japan in the 1980s and 1990s as a perfect example of how this plays out in the real world.
Okay, let's hear it.
For anyone listening who grew up navigating the Western medical system, the idea of a doctor hiding a cancer diagnosis from you probably sounds like grounds for a massive malpractice lawsuit.
Oh, it sounds like a total violation of your right to know your own body. I would be furious.
Exactly, to a Western ear. But in Japan at that time, the ethical standard of care was family-mediated disclosure.
Right.
In this system, the physician doesn't just drop a heavy terminal diagnosis directly onto a vulnerable patient. They speak to the eldest family member or a designated proxy.
So the family finds out before the patient?
Yes, and that person acts as a psychological filter. They gradually communicate the prognosis to the patient over time in a way that preserves the patient's emotional equilibrium and social harmony. It's a form of protective care rooted in deep familial devotion.
And what happened when Western bioethics entered the picture there?
It clashed violently. When Western-trained ethicists demanded that Japanese physicians bypass the family and directly disclose terminal diagnoses to the individual patient to secure their quote-unquote autonomous consent, it was perceived as brutal.
Really? Brutal?
Yes. It didn't empower the patient, it devastated the therapeutic alliance. The physician was seen as coldly abandoning the patient to face their mortality alone, stripping away the protective buffer of the family. It proves that exporting these consent frameworks across cultural contexts without understanding the underlying mechanisms actually causes harm.
That is a fascinating historical case, but I have to ask a very critical question about what we are actually protecting in that scenario.
Go ahead.
If we defer to relational ethics and family-mediated disclosure, aren't we just swapping one boss for another? We're replacing professional medical paternalism with familial paternalism.
Well, calling it paternalism is a very Western way of framing a deeply communal dynamic.
But the mechanics of the power dynamic are identical. Wait, so are you arguing that because a culture believes in community consent, a woman doesn't have the fundamental right to refuse a surgery her family demands?
No,
Or conversely, what happens when a young woman needs a life-saving intervention, but the communal consensus of her patriarchal family structure decides against it because, say, it costs too much? Autonomy says this is her body, her life, her choice. The safe deposit box protects her from being overruled by the collective.
Look, I am not advocating for coercion.
But if you remove that protection, you open an incredibly dangerous loophole for abuse. You allow the collective to simply subsume the individual.
Again, I am not advocating for coercion. I am pointing out that your very definition of coercion is based on an isolated view of the self. You're assuming that the individual is this distinct, easily separable entity from the collective. That is an ontological distinction. It's a fundamental difference in how we define what a human being actually is.
A biological human being is a single organism.
Biologically, perhaps, but morally and socially. Look at the African Ubuntu tradition. The philosophy is literally translated as, I am because we are.
Right.
Personhood is constituted through relationships. An individual does not exist in a vacuum. They exist as a node in a massive network of mutual obligation and care. Or look at Confucian relational ethics, driven by the virtue of ren or benevolence. In these traditions, communal decision-making isn't a violation of the patient. It is a reflection of who the patient actually is.
So how does that actually work in a modern clinical setting?
Let's take a clinical trial in a community operating under Ubuntu. If a Western researcher comes in and demands a private one-on-one signature on a 20-page informed consent document, they are committing an existential harm.
Wait, an existential harm? Just by asking for a signature?
Yes, because to force that patient to separate themselves from their community, to make a singular choice about their body without the consensus of their elders and family, is to ask them to act as a non-person. The individual understands their welfare as entirely dependent on the welfare of the community.
I see.
In that context, community consent is fundamentally more meaningful than individual consent. You cannot impose a Georgetown University ethics framework on a rural village in sub-Saharan Africa and expect it to yield ethical outcomes. It yields compliance on paper, but it destroys trust.
I hear the value of trust and community. I really do. But human rights cannot be relative to geography. We have seen what happens when we let local context override fundamental protections. But let's look at how modern global health governance has actually attempted to resolve this.
You mean the UNESCO Declaration?
Exactly. In 2005, the UNESCO Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights was drafted. This was the ultimate attempt to synthesize the exact tension we're debating right now.
And it is a perfect example of how this synthesis fails in practice.
I strongly disagree. I think it worked profoundly well as a conceptual blueprint. The UNESCO Declaration deliberately encompasses both individual autonomy and respect for cultural diversity. It demonstrates that we don't have to choose between the two.
But
we can maintain universal human rights, we can keep the safe deposit box, while still respecting how families want to participate in the banking process. It proves that the evolution from physician-centered ethics to rights-based frameworks doesn't have to erase cultural specificity.
Okay, but if you look closely at that UNESCO declaration, its comprehensiveness actually risks total incoherence.
Incoherence? By trying to be inclusive?
Exactly. Affirming both individual autonomy and cultural diversity sounds wonderful in a Geneva conference room, but it offers zero practical guidance on the ground when the two directly conflict.
Well,
It's a mathematical impossibility to honor both if an individual's choice violates a cultural norm. UNESCO basically says, respect both. What does a clinician do with that? We don't even have to speak in hypotheticals here. Let's look at the ultimate stress test of modern medical ethics, the COVID-19 pandemic.
The pandemic certainly put immense pressure on the friction between individual rights and collective welfare. I'll give you that.
It did more than that. It demonstrated that Western individualistic frameworks failed spectacularly when applied to contexts of extreme resource scarcity and communal living. When you have a health system built entirely around maximizing individual autonomy, it lacks the vocabulary to effectively manage a crisis requiring massive collective sacrifice. In highly individualistic societies, mask mandates and quarantine orders were fought as violations of autonomy.
Because they were restrictions on autonomy. Necessary ones, absolutely, but restrictions nonetheless.
But look at communities with communitarian traditions. They responded fundamentally differently. The instinct to protect the elder, to protect the whole, overrode the individual right to go to a restaurant. The most successful public health responses utilized what scholars call glocalization, where values might be universal, but governance and consent must display massive contextual flexibility.
Glocalization is an incredibly useful operational strategy. Tailoring public health messaging to local values saves lives, but we must be incredibly careful not to let contextual flexibility mask human rights abuses. I mean, the 5,000-year history of medical ethics is basically a progressive expansion of what counts as harm.
Expand on that.
Well, we started with the Code of Hammurabi in ancient Mesopotamia, which was purely outcome-based liability. If a surgeon slipped and blinded a patient, they lost their hand. It was about physical harm.
Right.
Later, we recognized informational harms like deception, then relational harms like breaching confidentiality, which was, central to the Hippocratic corpus. Today, in the 21st century, we recognize existential harms, violations of dignity and autonomy.
But whose definition of dignity are we using? That is the core issue.
The definition that recognizes that a patient, no matter their gender, caste, or social standing, cannot be subjected to a medical intervention without their understanding and agreement. The Belmont Report's 3 core principles, respect for persons, beneficence, and justice, were institutionalized because the alternative was the exploitation of marginalized groups.
But that's...
You mentioned epistemic injustice earlier. I would argue that the greatest injustice we can commit is to assume that certain populations don't require the strict protections of individual informed consent simply because their cultural heritage is communal. It treats them as less deserving of bodily sovereignty.
That is exactly the kind of essentialist thinking that traps us. You are equating communal consent with a lack of protection. You're assuming that a process guided by non-Western frameworks is inherently less protective than, say, an institutional review board in Boston.
Not less protective, just...
Let's look at how modern Islamic bioethics handles cutting-edge dilemmas, like the governance of artificial intelligence in end-of-life care.
Okay, how does a 1,000-year-old religious framework govern a machine learning algorithm?
By utilizing ijtihad, the Islamic practice of independent legal reasoning. Islamic scholars don't just quote ancient texts. They dynamically adapt principles of public interest and the preservation of life to modern dilemmas. If an AI suggests withdrawing life support, an Islamic bioethics framework wouldn't just look at what the individual patient wrote in an advance directive.
Right.
It would involve a consultative process weighing the AI's data against the family's input, the physician's expertise, and communal spiritual values. We see Gulf Cooperation Council countries integrating international clinical standards with these scholarly positions seamlessly. It is rigorous, it is highly protective, and it doesn't rely entirely on an isolated individual signature.
I am not saying those systems lack intellectual rigor or a desire to protect the patient. I'm saying that when a conflict arises, when the AI, the family, and the scholars all agree on one path, but the patient in their own body desires another, the individual must have the ultimate veto power.
That is what autonomy guarantees. It guarantees that the locus of moral authority ultimately resides inside the skin of the patient.
And I maintain that the very concept of the individual's body as a separate, autonomous fiefdom is a philosophical import that simply does not map onto global realities. True ethical practice requires methodological humility. It requires the decolonization of bioethics. We must integrate Islamic, Confucian, and Ubuntu frameworks as equal partners in global health governance. We cannot keep treating Western principalism as the sole moral authority that occasionally tolerates cultural quirks. As we step back from the specifics, I want to clearly summarize the dividing line here. I acknowledge that cultural context matters deeply. How a doctor communicates risk, how we involve extended families, and how we structure bedside care absolutely must adapt to the patient's reality. However, the history we've reviewed, specifically the dark chapters of colonial medicine and institutional abuse, requires that individual patient autonomy remains an immovable bedrock. The transition from virtue ethics to rights-based frameworks was necessary because history proved in blood that we needed a legal floor to prevent vulnerable people from being sacrificed for the greater good.
And I'll summarize my position by warning against the danger of a single triumphant narrative. The history of medical ethics is not a linear march from primitive, communal ignorance to enlightened Western autonomy. From the Egyptian papyrus, sophisticated prognostic triage, to the holistic virtue of the Ayurvedic tradition, profound moral frameworks have existed in parallel for millennia. To truly protect patients worldwide, we have to move beyond the assumption that individual autonomy is the only valid currency. We must recognize the profound validity of relational epistemologies, ensuring we don't commit knowledge injustice in our pursuit of uniform global compliance.
Yet despite our profound disagreement on the primacy of the individual, there is a powerful point of convergence we both draw from this massive historical timeline. And that is the absolute necessity of institutional humility.
Without question. Every single generation represented in this 5,000-year history believed its ethical frameworks were the most enlightened. The physicians who conducted the most horrific experiments in the 20th century were not, uneducated rogue actors. They were graduates of elite institutions operating under formal, widely accepted codes of professional ethics at the time.
Which tells us that the gap between articulated ethics, the beautiful declarations we write in Geneva, and practiced ethics, what actually happens to a patient in a crowded clinic, is a permanent structural feature of medicine. No framework, whether it's based on the rigid autonomy of Western bioethics or the profound benevolence of Sun Simio, is immune to corruption if it lacks ongoing, relentless critical oversight.
It really is remarkable to view this as a continuous conversation spanning millennia. I mean, from Hammurabi holding surgeons financially accountable with the threat of losing a hand, to our current debates over algorithmic bias in the ICU, we are constantly renegotiating the moral asymmetry between the healer, the patient, and the community.
And that negotiation proves that ethical frameworks must continuously evolve. They are not static artifacts locked in a museum. They are living tools that must respond to new technological realities and shifting social contracts. I hope today's discourse prompts everyone listening to examine their own cultural assumptions regarding health, decision-making, and what it truly means to own your body.
Because the moment we stop questioning our own assumptions, the moment we believe we've found the perfect, flawless ethical formula, is the exact moment our ethics become rigid dogma.
Which brings us back to the emergency room. We rely on O-negative blood as the universal donor because it's a biological absolute. But as we've explored today, when we try to force a single universal ethical donor onto the vastly diverse landscape of human values, we risk rejecting the very communal structures that sustain life. Is it possible to find a true ethical universal that protects every patient? Or are we forever bound to translate across the complex, messy borders of human culture? We leave that for you to consider.